Today is day 79 since Nancy Guthrie vanished, so it has now been almost 80 days since this 84-year-old woman literally just disappeared from her home in Tucson, Arizona. Some new information in this episode I'm getting into. First of all, remember the 2 ransom notes that came early on that went to the TV stations in Arizona? Those are the notes that we believe Savannah Guthrie was referencing when she said that she thought 2 of the notes were real and legitimate. Well, there was a Bitcoin account, and we've got some new information about a transaction in that Bitcoin account. I've spoken to several retired FBI profilers who have come up with a profile of who they believe is responsible for the Nancy Guthrie abduction based on the information that they have. And Steve is the perfect person because he has had investigations where he's used profilers before. I also wanted to see what he thought about some of what they're telling me. I wanted to ask you some questions about some of this new information that's come out in the Nancy Guthrie investigation and some of the information that I've learned from some of the profilers that I talked to. And I wanted to see, as an agent, how you would put that into action actually with the investigation. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about is this new information coming from Brianna Whitney, who's a reporter with the CBS station in Phoenix. And that's one of the stations that received the first 2 ransom letters, the ones that we believe Savannah was referencing when she said that she thought 2 were real. And they're now divulging, the station, that when they looked back into the Bitcoin wallet, there was activity on February 10th, and there's been no activity since. So this would have been a couple of months ago, right when the letters first came out. And a small amount of money was put into the account, along with a note that said, "We are ready to talk, contact us." And then there was a link for how to reach out to them. And there's no way to know for sure that that was the FBI or Savannah Guthrie, but it seems like it would kind of make sense. What do you think it means that they put that note in there, but it seems there was no response?
Well, I don't think we know that there was no response. There was no response that was visible to us. But I think that what that is the FBI saying, if it was the FBI, which makes sense, it's them saying, "Hey, we're in a negotiation here."
Imagine being 84 years old. You've lived a full life. You raise children who love you. You have grandchildren who call you. You have a daughter whose face appears on television screens across America every single morning. A daughter who, by every account, adores you completely. You live in a quiet neighborhood in the Catalina Foothills, outside Tucson, Arizona. A neighborhood with good streets, good neighbors, and a security camera on your front door so your family doesn't worry about you. On the night of January 31st, 2026, a member of your own family drops you off at your front door. You go inside. You get ready for bed. You are safe. You are home. And then, at some point in the dark hours before dawn, before the sun comes up, before the neighborhood stirs, before your pacemaker monitor sends its 2:28 a.m. transmission, someone comes for you. Not a stranger stumbling through the wrong door. Someone who knew which door was yours. This is Crime Dispatch. And today, 86 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home, we are going to walk through every piece of evidence that has emerged in this investigation, including what a reporter named Brian Entin found when he stood outside the property, connected to the last person to see her alive. What he documented there is something that once you hear, you will not be able to set aside. Stay with me, because this story deserves your full attention. Before we go any further, if you are new to Crime Dispatch, please subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell. This channel covers cases like Nancy Guthrie's with the depth and seriousness they deserve. No sensationalism, no rushing to conclusions, just the evidence, examined carefully. Subscribe so you don't miss a single update on this case. Now, let's go. Before we examine any evidence, before we walk through any timeline or piece of investigative data, I want to take a moment to talk about Nancy Guthrie as a person. Because in cases like this, the person at the center of the investigation can sometimes get lost inside the investigation itself. That is a failure we are not going to make here. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, who has anchored NBC's Today Show for over a decade. She is a grandmother. She is a woman whose family describes her with a kind of warmth and specificity that only comes when someone has genuinely been loved. Not as a symbol, not as a celebrity's mother, but as a real, irreplaceable human being in the lives of the people who know her. Savannah Guthrie has spoken publicly about her mother on multiple occasions since the disappearance. She has not spoken from a prepared media statement. She has spoken as a daughter who is frightened, who is heartbroken, and who is doing everything in her power to find the woman who raised her. She has committed $1 million of her own money as a reward for information leading to her mother's safe return. Let that settle for a moment. $1 million. From a daughter who does not know where her mother is, who cannot call her, who cannot check on her, who goes to work every morning and sits in front of a camera and does her job while somewhere, her 84-year-old mother is waiting. Nancy Guthrie deserves to be found. Her family deserves answers. And this investigation, despite the obstacles it has encountered, is working toward both. That is the human reality at the center of every piece of evidence we are about to discuss. Now let's talk about what that evidence actually is. For the first several weeks of this investigation, the public conversation focused heavily on the physical evidence at Nancy Guthrie's home. The blood on the front doorstep, the doorbell camera footage, the pacemaker transmission data, the open crime scene. The what, the when, the how. What received less attention, at least in the early weeks, was the who. There is a name that has sat at the center of this investigation since very early on, a name that investigators have been examining in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. That name is Tomaso Chioni, and I want to be precise about what we know and what we do not know. Tomaso Chioni has not been publicly charged with any crime as of the time of this recording. He is a person of interest, someone whose relationship to the victim and whose proximity to the events of that night have placed him under investigative scrutiny. That scrutiny is not a conviction. It is not even an accusation in the formal legal sense. Before we go into the reporting and the accountability investigation, I need to stop. Because February 11th is not a date in a news story. It may be a date that marks something that happened to a real person. An 84-year-old woman named Nancy Guthrie, who went to dinner with her family on January 31st, came home to the house she loved and was taken in the night, whose daughter Savannah has stood in front of cameras and refused to let the world look away, whose family has not stopped fighting. Whatever February 11th means, whatever the silence after it means, Nancy deserves to be at the center of how we receive this information. If you are a person of faith, please say a prayer for Nancy Guthrie right now. Dear Lord, we come before you with heavy hearts, lifting up Nancy Guthrie into your loving care. Dear Lord, we pray that if Nancy is out there, you would guide her safely back to those who love her. Wrap your protection around her in every moment and keep her safe from harm. We lift up Savannah, Annie, and every member of her family who has been living through these long days of uncertainty. Please give them strength when they feel weak, peace when fear rises, and hope when the waiting feels unbearable. Dear Lord, we ask for clarity where there is confusion. Let truth find its way to the surface, gently but surely. Guide every effort, every search, and every piece of evidence so that it leads in the right direction. Where there is darkness, bring light. Where there is pain, bring comfort. Where there is waiting, bring endurance. And where there is fear, bring your peace that passes understanding. If it is your will, bring Nancy home safely. And in all things, let truth and mercy prevail. Amen. I want you to type Amen. What it is significant. Here is why. Tomaso Chioni is not a neighbor. He is not someone whose path crossed Nancy Guthrie's in passing. He is her son-in-law. He is married to Savannah Guthrie's sister. He has been a member of this family throughout his marriage. He has been inside Nancy Guthrie's home. He has sat at her table. He has stood at her front door. In practical terms, this means Tomaso Chioni knew things about Nancy Guthrie that very few people outside her immediate family would know. He knew her address. He knew the layout of her home. He knew her security arrangements. He knew her routines. He knew how her family would respond to a crisis. He was someone Nancy Guthrie trusted completely. And on the night of January 31st, 2026, the last night before her world changed entirely, Tomaso Chioni was the last person to be with her. He dropped her off at her front door at approximately 9:50 p.m. He watched her go inside. And then he drove away. Now, let's build a timeline of what happened next. Because this is where the questions become very difficult to answer. If you are finding this analysis useful, if you appreciate the care we are taking with this story, please hit the like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel reach more people who care about cases like Nancy Guthrie's. Thank you. Let's continue. In any missing persons investigation, the timeline is the spine of the entire case. Every other piece of evidence attaches to it. Every theory has to be able to survive contact with it. Let me walk you through the timeline of February 1st, 2026, the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. 9:50 p.m., January 31st Street. Tomaso Chioni drops Nancy Guthrie off at her home in the Catalina Foothills. This is the last confirmed interaction she has with any known person before her disappearance. He was physically present at her property. He watched her go inside. Think about what that means. This is not a phone call. This is not a text message. This is a person who was standing at Nancy Guthrie's home. The same doorstep, the same address. Less than 4 hours before a masked and armed figure returned to that exact location. 1:47 a.m., February 1st. A figure appears at Nancy Guthrie's front doorstep. This person is masked. They are wearing gloves. They are armed. And one of the first things they do, one of the very first deliberate acts captured by the evidence record, is remove the doorbell camera from the wall. Pause on that for a moment. You do not remove a doorbell camera from someone's front door unless you know it is there. You do not know to bring the tools or the knowledge to remove it unless you have thought about it in advance. This is not improvised behavior. This is prepared behavior. This is someone who stood at that doorstep and planned, in advance, exactly how they would neutralize the one piece of technology most likely to record their presence. The window between 9:50 p.m. and 1:47 a.m. is 3 hours and 57 minutes. Nearly 4 hours. 4 hours is a meaningful amount of time. It is enough time to drive a significant distance and return. It is enough time to change clothing, change appearance, collect equipment, and compose yourself before approaching a target location. It is enough time to make a final decision about whether to proceed with something that had been planned across a period far longer than one single evening. 2:28 a.m., February 1st. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker monitor misses its scheduled transmission. A pacemaker monitor transmits on a schedule. It sends data because the device is operating, because the person wearing it is present, because the conditions required for transmission exist. When a transmission is missed, it means one of those conditions has changed. At 2:28 a.m., the digital record tells us with clinical precision what the blood on the front doorstep and the missing camera had already suggested. Nancy Guthrie was no longer in her home. Somewhere between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m., in a window of 41 minutes, an 84-year-old woman was taken from her bed. And Tomaso Chioni, the man who had been with her less than 4 hours earlier, was somewhere in Tucson. There is a particular kind of journalism that is becoming rarer in America. It is not the journalism of press conferences and official statements. It is not the journalism of waiting for an agency to decide what the public is ready to hear. It is the journalism of showing up, physically, personally, and documenting what is actually happening in front of you. Brian Entin practices that kind of journalism. He has been on the ground in Tucson, covering Nancy Guthrie's disappearance since the earliest days of the investigation. He was outside her home when the crime scene was still accessible to anyone willing to walk up to it. He was the reporter who stood in front of that house on day 4 and said plainly, without drama, without exaggeration, that what he was observing was not a good sign. Not because of the blood, but because of how the scene was being handled, because of who was and was not in control of that evidence. He said it when nobody in an official capacity was prepared to say it publicly. And when investigative activity began around the property connected to Tomaso Chioni, when law enforcement teams moved into multiple connected locations simultaneously, Brian Entin was already there. He watched, he documented, he reported. What he observed at the property connected to Tomaso Chioni was not a routine follow-up visit. Investigators were not stopping by to tick a procedural box. Items were removed from the property. The pattern and focus of the search indicated, according to Entin's reporting, that investigators had arrived with specific prior intelligence about what they were looking for, and they found it. When Brian Entin described what he witnessed as disturbing, and he used that word deliberately on a national broadcast to a national audience, I want you to understand the weight that carries. This is a journalist who has spent years standing in front of crime scenes, in front of missing persons cases, in front of the full range of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. When a person with that professional history uses the word disturbing, they are not reaching for dramatic effect. They are telling you what they saw. The specific contents of what was removed from the property have not been publicly disclosed. This is standard practice in an active federal investigation. Prosecutors require that the evidence chain remain intact, that the details of what was seized be preserved for courtroom presentation rather than public release. That restraint, as frustrating as it may feel from the outside, is actually a sign that this investigation is being handled with the seriousness it requires. But the documented fact of what was removed, and the manner in which it was removed, is on the record, and we are not the only ones who have noticed. Among the investigative theories that have emerged in this case is the possibility that whoever entered Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning of February 1st used a signal jamming device. I want to explain precisely what that means and why it matters. A signal jammer is electronic equipment specifically designed to block wireless communications. In the context of a residential security system, a signal jammer could prevent a doorbell camera from transmitting live footage. It could neutralize the wireless signals that alert a homeowner's security provider to an intrusion. It could, in short, render a modern home's digital defenses temporarily blind. Signal jammers are not something a person picks up impulsively. They are not available at every electronics store. Obtaining one requires deliberate research, deliberate procurement, and a very specific prior knowledge that a wireless security system exists at the location you plan to enter, and that you need to neutralize it before you arrive. Now ask yourself a straightforward question. Who, among the people connected to Nancy Guthrie's life, would have known she had a wireless security system? Who would have known the specific make and model of her doorbell camera, the Google Nest device visible from her front doorstep? Who would have known the layout of her home well enough to understand which entry points could be approached and which could not? A stranger conducting research would know some of this from digital reconnaissance. But a member of the family, someone who had stood at that front doorstep dozens of times, who had passed through those rooms, who had operated within that household as a trusted presence, would know all of it. Instinctively, without research, the signal jammer theory, in the context of a suspect who had intimate knowledge of that property, stops being a theory about a sophisticated outside intruder. It becomes something considerably more specific. One of the most significant pieces of evidence to emerge from this investigation is something that did not happen on the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. It happened months earlier, quietly, digitally, and deliberately. Investigators identified image searches conducted specifically for Nancy Guthrie's home address in the Catalina Foothills. These searches were conducted twice, once in March 2025, and again between November 30th and December 1st, 2025. 10 months before she disappeared, then 60 days before she disappeared, someone, using a connected device, typed Nancy Guthrie's home address into a search engine and looked for photographs of the exterior of that property. Not once, as a casual curiosity, but twice, at specific intervals, in a pattern that investigators recognized as deliberate. Now think about who would need to conduct that kind of reconnaissance, and who would not. A complete stranger to Nancy Guthrie would have an obvious reason to search for images of her home. They would need to understand the exterior layout, the entry points, the camera positions, the approach angles from the street. For someone who had never been to that property, those searches serve a functional purpose. But a son-in-law who had visited that home throughout his marriage, who had stood at that front doorstep, who had been inside those rooms, who knew what that property looked like from every conceivable angle, what would he need to confirm through a Google image search that he did not already know from direct, repeated, personal experience? Unless those searches were not about general familiarity, unless they were about something more specific, confirming a camera position, verifying a sightline, understanding what the approach to the front door looks like from the street, through the eyes of someone who needed to plan a precise approach at 1:47 in the morning. The FBI subpoenaed Google for the IP address data connected to those searches. That subpoena placed in federal investigators' hands the device from which those searches were made, the account associated with that device, and the full digital trail connecting both to a specific person. That data is now at Quantico. I want to take a moment before discussing the ransom notes to acknowledge something that is easy to lose sight of in an analytical discussion of evidence. Savannah Guthrie received ransom notes about her mother. She sat with those notes, demand letters, threatening communications, documents that told her someone had her mother and wanted something in exchange for her return, and she had to decide what to do. She had to read them and respond, knowing that the wrong response, the wrong move, could endanger the woman who raised her. That is an almost unimaginable weight to carry, and she has carried it publicly, and with a grace that deserves acknowledgement before we examine what the notes themselves tell us from an investigative perspective. Multiple ransom notes were sent in this case. They went not only to the family and to law enforcement, but to media outlets, national broadcast networks, news organizations. The notes demanded payment. They set deadlines. They applied pressure through public channels, using the media as a lever against the family. Savannah Guthrie stated publicly that she believed at least some of the notes were legitimate, that they came from whoever had her mother. Now consider what an effective ransom note actually requires to produce. You need to know the family's financial capacity. You need to understand whether they are the kind of people who will go immediately to federal authorities or try to manage the situation privately. You need to know which member of the family is most likely to respond and how. You need to understand with psychological precision where this particular family's vulnerability lies. What threat will generate the most immediate, compliant response? A stranger can research a family, but research produces an approximate picture. It misses the texture, the specific dynamics, the way this particular daughter responds to threat, the way this particular family makes decisions under pressure. That texture, that specificity, comes from knowing a family personally. Behavioral analysts who examined the ransom notes in this case described a communication profile consistent with intimate, rather than researched, knowledge of the Guthrie family. The notes reflected familiarity, psychological targeting, an understanding of this specific family that was not built from a database search. It was built from years of sitting at the same table. This investigation did not begin cleanly, and the people who love Nancy Guthrie deserve to have that stated plainly. When Brian Entin stood outside Nancy Guthrie's home on day 4, he documented something that official accounts were not yet ready to acknowledge. The crime scene was not being handled with the discipline this situation demanded. The property was accessible. The evidence was not under the kind of protected, rigorous forensic control that an abduction investigation of this magnitude requires. A camera crew could approach. A journalist could observe. Anyone could walk up to a doorstep that should have been locked down completely within hours of the first emergency call. That failure had consequences. Evidence that might have been cleanly preserved was exposed to conditions that compromised its integrity. Those first hours, the most forensically critical hours of any crime scene investigation, were not protected in the way they should have been. But the failure did not stop there. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos blocked access to Quantico, the FBI's federal laboratory with probabilistic genotyping capabilities, with genetic genealogy pipelines, with analytical resources that far exceed what any local agency can deploy, for 10 weeks. 10 weeks while Nancy Guthrie was missing. 10 weeks while an 84-year-old woman was waiting for someone to find her. 10 weeks of federal capability sitting unused while a local sheriff managed institutional turf. When that decision became public, the response was significant. County supervisors called for the sheriff's resignation. A recall effort was launched against him. He was questioned under oath on April 21st. The relationship between local and federal investigators had, by that point, shifted in ways that were unlikely to reverse themselves. The FBI is no longer asking for access. It has the evidence. The DNA is at Quantico. The cell tower mapping is underway. The Google subpoena data has been received. The items removed from the suspect's property are being analyzed. The failures of the first weeks are documented. They are part of this case's permanent record. And one day, when prosecutors stand up in a courtroom and present what this investigation produced, those early failures will matter, both for what they cost and for what was ultimately recovered in spite of them. For Nancy Guthrie's family, those 10 weeks are not an abstraction. They are 10 weeks of not knowing, 10 weeks of waiting, 10 weeks that no one can give back. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the unit responsible for generating psychological profiles of violent offenders, completed a profile of whoever abducted Nancy Guthrie. I want to walk through what that profile describes, because when you lay it alongside the confirmed facts of Tomaso Chioni's relationship to this case, the alignment is worth examining carefully. The profile describes someone with specific prior knowledge of the target and her property. The 2 rounds of digital reconnaissance, conducted 10 months before and 60 days before the disappearance, are consistent with that description. The profile describes someone capable of sustained, long-term planning. The sequence of preparation visible in this case, the reconnaissance, the signal jammer acquisition, the propping of rear entry points before the abduction, the precise timing of the approach at 1:47 a.m., reflects planning that extended across weeks or months. This is not opportunistic crime. This is organized crime. The kind of methodical, patient, deliberate planning that requires someone to hold a plan in their mind for a very long time and never break from it. The profile describes someone whose Ransom communications reflected psychological familiarity with the target family. Someone who understood precisely where the pressure points were and how to apply force to them with maximum effect. And the profile includes one more element that I want to highlight specifically. The profiler noted that someone of this psychological type, at this point in the investigation, with DNA at Quantico, with search evidence being processed, with a national media apparatus watching every development, would be experiencing extraordinary psychological pressure. People of this profile, under this level of scrutiny, tend to make errors. Not necessarily dramatic errors, but small ones. The kind that generate new forensic trace. The kind that give investigators something they did not have the week before. The walls, as the profiler put it, are closing, and whoever is inside them knows it. Let me give you an honest accounting of where this investigation stands as of day 86. Not where we hope it stands. Not where the most optimistic reading would place it. Where the confirmed public record tells us it actually is. The DNA. Biological material collected from inside Nancy Guthrie's home is at Quantico. It is being processed through probabilistic genotyping software and prepared for comparison through the CODIS criminal database and genetic genealogy pipelines. These are not fast processes. They are rigorous ones. If no criminal database match emerges, genetic genealogy can extend the search to family connections. The cell tower data. The FBI's CAST unit, the Cellular Analysis Survey Team, is reconstructing the digital footprint of every active phone in the Catalina Foothills area on the night of January 31st and the early morning hours of February 1st. This data maps who was where, when, including a son-in-law who was confirmed present at Nancy Guthrie's property that evening. The Google subpoena. The IP address records from the image searches conducted in March 2025 and November 2025 are in the FBI's possession. The device, the account, the connection from a digital search to a physical person. That trail has been requested, obtained, and is being analyzed. The search evidence. The items removed from the suspect's property, documented by Brian Entin, reported to a national audience on NewsNation, are part of the active evidence package. The behavioral profile. The psychological portrait of a person who planned this across 10 months, executed it with precision, and communicated through ransom notes that reflected intimate knowledge of the Guthrie family has been delivered to the investigators now pulling every thread simultaneously. This investigation is not cold. It is not stalled. It is building. I want to come back to where we started. An 84-year-old woman, a quiet home in the Catalina Foothills, a family that loves her, a daughter who puts her face on television every morning and keeps going, because that is what her mother would want her to do. The central question of this investigation, the question this entire body of evidence is designed to answer, is whether the person responsible for taking Nancy Guthrie is someone who knew her, someone she trusted, someone she would not have been alarmed to see at her door. The evidence does not answer that question in a public statement. It answers it in a laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, in a cell tower dataset being mapped by a federal analytical team, in a digital trail that begins with a Google image search in March 2025 and ends wherever it ends. What I can tell you, having examined this evidence carefully and without exaggeration, is this. The investigation is active. The resources committed to it are significant. The failures of the early weeks have been identified and partially corrected. The FBI is processing evidence with tools that were denied to this case for 10 critical weeks, and those tools are among the most powerful forensic instruments in the world. Nancy Guthrie has people fighting for her, her daughter, her family, a journalist named Brian Entin, who has not left the story, a national audience that refuses to look away, and now, finally, a federal investigation operating with the authority and the resources it should have had from the very first morning. Somewhere tonight, Nancy Guthrie is waiting. I believe she deserves to be found. I believe the people who love her deserve to know the truth. And I believe that truth, however difficult, however painful, is closer today than it was 86 days ago. This is Crime Dispatch. We will be here when the next development breaks. We will cover it with the same care and seriousness that Nancy Guthrie's story requires. Thank you for watching.